This is Analytics with Asa, and today, for the first time, we are on video. And I am joined today by Pete Nova, partner of the FF Faceoff YouTube channel. Pete, how you doing today, man?
I'm doing good. Playoffs are coming. My Broncos get the Bills this weekend. Hopefully that's not a bloodbath. But yeah, excited to kind of move into the offseason for some teams as well as to kind of hit the playoffs. Excited for it.
Yes, my team is still in it as well, but we did not have a great outing last week, but we'll see how things go against the Rams. But today, we are here to kind of talk about the entirety of the regular season, but most importantly, the awards, because regular season just wrapped up this week. And so everyone has kind of made their final case as to why they should win their awards. And I think a fun exercise that we can do to kind of kick off the video format of this show is to make the case. So we'll each discuss different candidates for each award, and I want you to make the case for each person. So what I did first is I took the top two players and Vegas betting odds for each award, and I want you to make the case for the favorite. So I think we can start with the defensive rookie of the year, and our betting favorite is Jared Verse. So why do you think he deserves to win defensive rookie of the year?
Yeah, I mean, Jared Verse was one of my favorite edge rushers. It was my actual favorite edge rusher in this class. He fills in on a defense that many expected to take a step back this year. With the loss of their defensive coordinator heading over to the Falcons, it did take some time for this defense to adjust, but they've gotten better and better. Now there are some weaknesses on the back end, but Jared Verse has been leading the charge for the improvement. I mean, they've held teams under 9 points, no, under 10 points, 3 weeks straight. Coming into last week, which I didn't really count too much because they didn't play their starters. But prior to the last week of the season, they went on a 3-game streak of holding teams to under 10 points. And Jared Verse was a big part of that. Jared Verse is 4th in pressures this season with 77. And that's not including just rookies. That's including the entire NFL. He's a guy that has an explosive first step, elite bend and flexibility, multiple counter moves as well. And he's just a guy that has been a big part as to why this defense has turned the corner. And edge rusher is a big impact position. And while there are corners and other positions on the field that can be deserving as well, I feel like it's more notable for an edge rusher, how he impacts the game and disrupts it. And Jared Verse has been the best rookie, in my opinion, especially at the edge rusher position.
Yeah, I think you make a great case because edge rusher is largely a strong link position where it's better to have one elite guy and one average guy than to have two good guys. And Jared Verse being an elite guy his first year is something that has a serious impact on this Rams defense. And I mean, they're all babies out there. It's a super young defense, but it's gotten significantly better as the weeks have gone on. And I just think that speaks to how talented Jared Verse is as an edge rusher. But the guy that I want to talk about, he is second in odds. And I will point out there is quite the discrepancy in odds, with Jared Verse being minus 700 and my guy, Quinyon Mitchell, being plus 650. But I think Quinyon Mitchell has been incredible this season. First off, he's 73.1 PFF grade, which is 21st among cornerbacks. To do that as a rookie is not the easiest thing to do in the world. He has 9 pass breakups, which is really good. But I think the most important thing is the impact that he had on the team's defense, because cornerback is not the easiest position to really quantify because it's mainly a stop your guy from doing something. If they don't throw the ball your way, you're doing a good job. But I think the biggest thing that shows how impactful Jared Verse was, or that Quinyon Mitchell was, is that the Eagles now have a success rate of 39.9%, which is lowest in the NFL. And that's down from 29th last season. So they went from arguably worst in the NFL to first in success rate. And it's because this Fangio system is reliant heavily on a dominant boundary corner. And having a guy like Quinyon Mitchell being so dominant on the boundary allows guys like Cooper DeJean to play the nickel, and it allows Darius Slay to also play that other edge side. So having good corners has really made an impact, especially because this defense was already good up front. So fulfilling that final piece, which was having those two corners, was really impactful. And I think he can make a really strong case for defensive rookie of the year.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and this is a defense that, it's crazy because things happen so fast in the NFL, right? Beginning of the year, this was one of the worst defenses in the NFL. I
Mhm.
mean, if you're playing fantasy football, this was a defense that like every analyst was saying to target wide receivers playing this secondary because they were giving up one of the largest explosive rates in the entire NFL to the wide receiver position. And the Fangio system, again, it's a new system similar to Jared Verse. Like it takes some time for guys to learn these new systems, and Fangio's system is not extremely simple. It's complex, and so because of that, I think it took them time. They gave the reins to the rookies. I think at first Fangio wanted to stick with some veterans, right, and his stubbornness got in the way of that, and so eventually he allowed these young guys like Cooper DeJean and Quinyon Mitchell to get more reps. And in doing so, this defense has turned a corner and become one of the best in the NFL, which is why they are actually my favorite in the NFC to come out of the conference because I think they have the best defense in this conference right now. And Quinyon Mitchell is in large a big piece of that. And he's definitely deserving. I think the odds being him at plus 650, I think it's a little closer than that. But odds makers, they don't want to give any. They know Jared Verse is probably going to win it, and they don't want to give anybody a chance of winning money on Verse because he's such a heavy favorite.
Yeah, both of these guys came early in the draft and they were just incredible. And speaking of that, let's talk about the offensive rookie of the year. So, one thing I just want to say really quick is how good has this draft been? It seems like almost everyone has hit in the first few rounds, and that's not something that you can really say a lot. But the first guy, and arguably the best guy who's come out of this draft, is Jaden Daniels. And I saw his betting odds, and it kind of made me chuckle, but he is at minus 10,000 to win Offensive Rookie of the Year. So why don't you make the case for Jaden Daniels?
I think the big thing for Jaden Daniels is, I mean, look, EPA is not everything, right? He has a 102.9 total EPA this year in all of his games played. And that's a big deal. Now, for those that aren't big stat nerds, to make a simpler case, Jaden Daniels brought a team to 8 more wins this year. And when you look at the rookie of the year last year, CJ Stroud, he increased their win total by 7 and took them to the playoffs, right? This is a Washington Commanders team who was in a rebuild, right? And he took a rebuilding team in his first year and increased them 8 wins and got them to the playoffs in a tough division. I mean, granted, the Cowboys were not what we expected them to be this year, but they ended up with 7 wins, right? So, I mean, with the injuries that they dealt with, right? Jaden Daniels played against the Eagles. He played against some tough competition this year. And so to bring them up 8 wins from where they were the year prior is an extremely incredible feat. And to me, when you look at him, he's 6th all time in passing touchdowns. Ironically, the quarterback, Bo Nix, who was the guy that was, in contention with him for a while, Bo Nix ended up having more passing touchdowns. But when you really look at all of the numbers, 6th all time with 25 passing touchdowns as a rookie, he has an 88 point, I'm sorry, his passing rating is one of the higher ratings in the entire NFL from a pro football focus standpoint. He's leading in tons of different metrics, and he's just played really special. And he's playing like, Bo Nix had a really good year. And in another year, there's a good chance he does win Rookie of the Year. But Jaden Daniels is playing as one of the best actual quarterbacks in the NFL. I mean, he has a case for MVP, in my opinion. Now, I don't think he's not going to come close to the top guys there, but I think like he's closer to the MVP conversation, and Bo Nix is closer to offensive rookie of the year conversation, right? And there's levels to that, and I think Jaden Daniels is just on another level right now, and he's separated himself as just one of those guys. So I find it hard to imagine him not getting this award.
And before I talk about my guy, one guy I want to say I'm so happy for is Terry McLaurin. He's finally found his wide receiver because that poor guy has put up great numbers with, to put it nicely, some different guys at quarterback. And so he's finally found his guy of the future. And Jaden Daniels coming out of college was always a great runner and a great passer of the football. The biggest concern was his ability to avoid sacks. And he hasn't been spectacular at that this season. But despite that, he's still been so good at turning negative plays into positive outcomes. And I remember earlier in the season, he scored on almost every drive, whether it be field goal or touchdown. But just doing that in avoiding punts and avoiding interceptions. I think that's really impressive, especially to do at just being a rookie. But the guy I want to talk about is someone who's already broken some records, and that is Brock Bowers. So once again, quite crazy betting odds, but Brock Bowers is at plus 3,000 to win Offensive Rookie of the Year. But he has 112 receptions on the year, which is most by any rookie ever. So that actually broke Puka Nakua's record. And I think he actually took it back from Malik Neighbors, who broke it the week prior. But he is 8th in yards among all receivers. So not just tight ends, not just wide receivers, among all receivers, he is 8th in yards. He is 1st among all tight ends. He's just been spectacular. And one of the more impressive things is the fact that it's really difficult to break out early as a tight end, whether it be TJ Hawkinson, who took a few years, whether it be Kyle Pitts, who had a great rookie year and then kind of fell off ever since then. But normally these guys kind of take time to marinate. And Brock Bowers just came out being like a top 5 tight end instantly. And I think that's really, really impressive. And he had an 88.4 receiving grade, which is really impressive. And he was really the only thing that made the offense move. You had Alexander Madison as your starting running back, which is, as someone who watched him play in Minnesota, he's a great backup, but he's definitely not a starter. And then you had Aiden O'Connell and Gardner Minshew throwing him the ball all year. And when you have that, and despite those circumstances, you're still breaking records, I think that's really impressive. And I think it reminds me a lot of the Justin Jefferson versus Justin Herbert debate that we had a few seasons ago, where you had a guy who legitimately broke some records in his position, with Jefferson breaking records that year. And then you have a guy like Herbert, who just instantly the team knows is their quarterback of the future. And there's kind of a debate because quarterback will almost always be more valuable. But when you're breaking records, it's difficult to really argue against that. But I think both these guys have really strong cases. Did you have anything on Brock Bowers?
Yeah, I think you make a good point on Bowers. I think people, we've gotten so used to the last 2 years of tight ends breaking onto the scene and just tight ends developing at earlier on in their career. I mean, Trey McBride took it an extra year. He was blocked by Zach Ertz. Last year we had Laporta break onto the scene, and McBride had an awesome year 2 and another great year 3. And so we've come accustomed to expecting this now, and it's not something that we should expect. I mean, maybe there's a change in, these guys and how they're developing in college. Maybe that's something to do with the coaching that they're getting. And maybe that's something in the future that when we get more data, we'll say, hey, you know what, this is something that guys are coming into the league more ready and more prepared. But tight end is a hard position because you're playing pretty much 2 positions. You're basically playing tackle and you're playing tight ends. You're a receiver and a blocker at the same time. And take a guy like Greg Dulcich, right? For Denver, like part of the reason he never panned out is because he can't block. If you're not an elite receiver like Kyle Pitts, he can't block, right? So part of his game was being an elite receiver, and that's part of why he has struggled to get onto the field. When you look at Brock Bowers, he's been able to come in, be good as a blocker, and be great as a receiver. And I think the tough thing for Bowers is Puka Nakua didn't get it last year, and so many of these awards have become quarterback dominated. Puka Nakua broke the receiving record for receptions and yards last year, right? And he didn't end up winning the award. And now Bowers ends up breaking his award the next year in receptions. Not his award, his record, and he breaks it the next year. And so it's just tough for Bowers, and it's unfortunate that, I feel like these awards need to be like almost segmented where it's just specific for quarterbacks, because it is a crime that Brock Bowers likely will not get this award. But like you said, he's working in an offense that really, I mean, he doesn't have much to work with, not much throwing him the football. They don't sustain drives very well. So the opportunities are, he's getting a lot of opportunities because there's not a lot of weapons around him, they're also not on the field nearly as much as a good offense would be. So that hinders the amount of snaps that he gets on the field, as opposed to maybe other guys that are rookies at the tight end position or at the quarterback position or whatever, right? So that all plays a part in it, but he's definitely deserving, and it's a shame that he's probably not going to win it.
No, absolutely. So the next award I want to talk about is the Coach of the Year award. So we kind of had a Coach of the Year face-off last week with Kevin O'Connell, the betting favorite at, it is, -1,000, and Dan Campbell, who was the underdog at plus 550. So why don't you first make the case for Kevin O'Connell? And I will say, as a Vikings fan, I'm listening very closely.
Yeah, I mean, we talked about it prior to the show, right? I mean, their win total from a Vegas standpoint, 6.5 wins. This was not a team that was projected to perform well. We didn't look at them as a playoff team, right? And so to do what they're doing in the hardest division in football is even that more impressive. You look at what they had gone through this offseason. They lost Kirk Cousins, right? Obviously, they were talking about the guy that replaced him. They lost Marcus Davenport. They lost Jordan Hicks, Danielle Hunter. So they were going through a semi rebuild, and we didn't know which guys were going to come back. There were some restructures as well, and they did a really good job at bringing in, patchwork players that guys didn't know, and that has something to do with the GM. But at the same time, like, O'Connell has been able to coach these guys up. They also lost Darashaw, who's a Pro Bowl, arguably an all-pro left tackle. Unfortunately, he plays in the same conference as Lane Johnson. But it's just he's doing a lot with expectations that weren't high and a lot of turnover. And nobody expected Sam Darnold to be a guy, right? We weren't expecting this, and it was supposed to be JJ McCarthy. I think I expected it to be maybe Darnold until he flamed out, maybe a couple of games, and then when things get rough, maybe they move over to JJ. But it's been pretty impressive to see what O'Connell's doing, and he's absolutely deserving of this award.
Yeah, O'Connell, he's been a great coach, and I could talk about him all day. But I think the biggest thing about O'Connell is the culture that he's built and the plays that he's called on offense. And, I don't think that Sam Darnold is just a bad quarterback. I think he's clearly a lot more talented than the media kind of wrote him off to be a few seasons ago. But the fact that he was able to unlock this guy after multiple coaches over multiple regimes were not able to do that just says a lot about the belief that Darnold has in him and the rest of the players have in him. And you said it best, being 6.5 as your Vegas win total and then exceeding that by 7-8 wins is just, it says so much about how talented he is as a coach. But the guy I want to talk about, who is his division neighbor, is Dan Campbell. And Dan Campbell has a very different case than Kevin O'Connell because typically the award goes to the guy who exceeded expectations the most. And I think Kevin O'Connell, based on that traditional metric, is the guy who probably fits that the best. But Dan Campbell had a different type of adversity to go through, and it's kind of been the talk of the league, but it's injuries. So there are 16 players that are currently on IR, and that is all Detroit Lions players, and most of them are on the defensive side. And to do all of that, to be the number one seed in football, to be the best offense in football, despite these injuries, says a lot about the culture that Dan Campbell himself has built. And I think the two coordinators that he has just says a lot about how intelligent he is as a guy. And, people kind of associate him with being this tough, smash mouth football type of guy. And there's no doubt he definitely is that as well. But it's more important that he's also clearly really intelligent. So what I found the most interesting is that over the course of this season and last season, he was number one in win probability added based on coaches' decisions. So what that means is the way that you're using timeouts, the way that you're going for two, the way that you're going for it on fourth down, he was number one among all coaches in that category. And that says a lot about the direct decisions that he makes impacting his team. And it's definitely built that culture up as well, where the team now wants to go for it on fourth down. They're not timid. They're not scared to go for it on fourth down. And it just says a lot about how talented he is as a coach. Did you have any thoughts on Dan Campbell?
Yeah, I mean, Campbell, I mean, you said pretty much everything I would have said for Campbell. I mean, it's unfortunate. I don't think he beat out expectations this year, to be honest. I mean, I don't know if anybody had them finishing as number one, but pretty damn close. But I don't. I mean, the only case you can really make is they did have a lot of injuries to the defensive side of the football. And while this defense is not as talented as others, they still play hard, even these backups. And he's also, it's funny, like you would look at him as a defensive coach, but he's really an offensive coach. He played tight end like in the
Mhm.
NFL. So I don't look at Campbell. I don't look at him above Kevin O'Connell. I just think what Kevin O'Connell has done with the hand that was dealt to him has been extremely impressive. Dan Campbell's had a great year, but this has to go to Kevin O'Connell.
Yeah, as much as I wanted to make the case, I largely agree with you. And Dan Campbell, you could make an argument about who's the better coach, but if you're categorizing the person who deserves the award the most, I think O'Connell's just been great so far. So the next award to talk about is the Defensive Player of the Year. So first up, we have Patrick Surtain. He is at -200. Why don't you make the case for Patrick Surtain?
Yeah, this is one of the closer ones that we have. I think TJ Watt didn't really make a strong impact in the last game of the year, which is what shifted these odds. I still think it could be close though. It wouldn't surprise me if Vegas came out and these odds changed before the actual voting happens. Because when you look at this award, I mean, a corner has only won this award one time since 2011, and it was Stephon Gilmore. And so it's not really when we talked about the defensive rookie of the year, part of the reason Jared Verse is going to win it is because he's an edge rusher and it looks like there's more impact. Like visually as a fan, even the voters, like most of these voters, they're not sitting here watching all 22 tape and watching the secondary cover, wide receivers in the back end when a ball's not thrown to them. So they're watching those guys that impact the play. And it's very visually appealing and also in your face when you see these edge rushers go. When you look at Surtain, though, I mean, the five Pro Bowlers, he's faced five AFC Pro Bowl pass catchers. Zay Flowers, Jerry Jeudy, Jamar Chase, Travis Kelce, and Brock Bowers. And per Next Gen Stats, they ran 92 routes against him and were targeted just 16 times. He gave up 6 receptions for 56 yards, an 8.3 rating, and 2 interceptions with 0 touchdowns. Now, Jamar Chase did drop that touchdown against him, so that definitely helps. But when you look at those guys versus everyone else in the entire NFL, 155, to me, Surtain's case, when you look at passer rating, right? I mean, 39.1 passer rating is what he allowed in coverage. And the crazy stat if you're on Twitter, I'm sure you've seen it. If a quarterback threw the football into the dirt on every single play, they'd have a better passer rating of 39.6 than they would targeting Patrick Surtain this year. TJ Watt's had an awesome year, and I know we're going to get into him. To me, there wasn't, I think Trey Hendrickson has probably a better case than TJ Watt, to be honest with you. But like when you look at the amount of sacks that the sack leaders have each and every single year, this was a down year for the sack leader, and it is Trey Hendrickson right now. And Trey Hendrickson, I believe I just had it in front of me. Trey Hendrickson right now has 17 and a half sacks. The sack leader last year was TJ Watt with 19, then it was 18 and a half, and then 22 and a half. So over the last 4 years, it was a slightly down year. But I think Trey Hendrickson honestly might have a better case than TJ Watt. But what are your thoughts?
Yeah, so starting with Patrick Surtain, he's just been incredible. And it's just so impressive to be able to see a cornerback just lock up any receiver. And you have Jamar Chase, who's a top 2-3 receiver in football, and to have 0 touchdowns allowed against him, almost no catches, just says a lot about the talent that Surtain really presents. And I think you bring up a great point about the importance of being able to quantify something. That with edge rusher, you have things like pressures, you have things like sacks, you have tackles, you have ways to measure how well someone plays. But with cornerback, it's almost like the best cornerbacks don't get the ball thrown to them. And that's kind of been the story of Surtain, that despite having a good amount of interceptions, he's someone who is so good that most quarterbacks now just know don't throw the ball to Surtain. And so that is almost reason enough to give him the Defensive Player of the Year. But with TJ Watt specifically, he's kind of in a weird case because he's low in pressures. I think he has only 44 on the year, which is quite a bit less than Jared Verse, the rookie. But he has a 92.2 defensive pass rush grade per PFF, which is really, really good. He has 12 sacks, but probably the thing that sticks in the head most for voters is the 6 forced fumbles that he has, which is 2 more than the second place guy who's also on the Steelers. I think another thing with TJ Watt is that he has a 91 run defense grade, and pretty much he's the anchor of that defense. And I think you and I both know that defense is the main reason they're in the playoffs now, with their offense kind of starting to stumble. But he's really been the leader of that defense. And I don't have the double team numbers in front of me, but I can imagine he's someone who also gets focused on a lot. So being able to have that impact, despite just being one player, says a lot about the talent that TJ Watt is. But I think Surtain can also make just as, if not stronger, of an argument for Depoy.
Yeah, I think that the only thing I was to say about Watt too, which was such a weird stat, they actually generate. I think I saw more pressure as a team with him off the field. But the funny thing is, you could make the argument that the reason they generate more pressure is because they have to send more players with TJ Watt when he's not on the field. So that's why they are generating more pressure, because they're dialing up more blitzes and sending more guys. Where when you have Watt on the field, you don't have to. You can rush 4 and drop everybody back and still get home. But yeah, I mean, TJ Watt's had a good year. I would be curious. I would love to do like a TJ Watt versus Trey Hendrickson and see how they match up with each other. But the 6 forced fumbles, to your point, I mean, is an insane impact. And that's really the most eye-popping thing when it comes to him.
Yeah, and I think, big plays like that tend to stick in the minds of voters. And speaking of big plays, the next award we have discussing is the Offensive Player of the Year. So this has kind of been crowned the non-quarterback MVP, and there's really 2 guys that are in the running for this award. First, we have Saquon Barkley, and he is at a staggering minus 10,000 for some sports books. Why don't you make the case first for Saquon Barkley?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have to sit here and tell you, if you've watched the NFL this year, you know how awesome Saquon Barkley's been. Saquon Barkley, almost passed Eric Dickerson's rookie rushing record. Obviously, he was sat out, which probably, I mean, some people get annoyed. My dad, an older guy, right? He sits there and he gets super frustrated that, the game has changed, right? But look at Zay Flowers, right? I mean, like, he suffered an injury that could have been scarier in a game that they probably didn't need him. But when you look at Saquon Barkley, Dickerson had 379 carries. Saquon had 345 carries. Now, people will say Saquon had the extra game, but he's also touched the ball on the ground over 30 less times. And so when you compare him to Eric Dickerson, like, he would have shattered that record if he played. And I think the big thing for me, which we talked about prior to this, is he had 15 total touchdowns this year, but Jalen Hurts took a lot of touchdowns away from him. Jalen Hurts had more than 8 of his touchdowns this year on the ground from Jalen Hurts were from the tush push that Saquon Barkley got them down to that yard line, and they just pushed it in. So Jalen Hurts had 14 rushing touchdowns this year. Like, you could argue that, like, if those tush pushes weren't there, Saquon Barkley's more than capable of getting it in. He easily could have hit over 20 touchdowns this year. So he's had a phenomenal year, and honestly, I loved the addition when he went there. I think he's going to be good for the next few years behind that offensive line.
Yeah, Saquon, like, there's so much you can say about him, but I think the defining moment in the season was the backwards hurdle. Like, no one can make that move aside from Saquon. And it just says that whenever he's actually met with some talent on the field, where he's not the only guy out there who's moving the ball at all, like he was with the Giants, he can do so much. And that's really the story of this season with Saquon. And he's definitely deserving. I think one guy who also has just been insane this year is Jamar Chase. So his Vegas odds are plus 2,800. But the first argument I kind of want to make for the case of Jamar Chase is that receivers, at least in the analytical world, tend to be a bit more valuable than running backs, just in the sense that throwing the ball through the air generally means you're going to move the ball more effectively than when you run it. But not even just that, being a Triple Crown winner in receptions, touchdowns, and receiving yards just says a lot about the talent that Chase really presents. He had 17 touchdowns, which was number one in the NFL by a mile for receivers. And he's clearly a top 2 receiver in football. I may argue Jefferson being a Vikings fan, but you could even make the case for Chase being better. What's so sad about the Bengals is that just with a competent defense, not even a great defense, a competent defense, they easily make the playoffs. He's 6th in the NFL in yards per route run, and he has a 121 rating when targeted, which is MVP level. So, Jamar Chase is really, really good. It's kind of a shame that we're not going to be able to see him in the postseason, but he's been a guy who I've loved to watch this season, and he's going to be good for well over a decade.
Yeah. And every year you can make the case that one guy, wide receiver, is going to be a position that honestly it's going to change every year, and you're splitting hairs on which guy is the best. Jamar Chase, it sucks. Triple Crown winner to not win is kind of a shame, because we talked about this, but it's more rare. We have seen less Triple Crown winners than we have seen guys win, rush for over 2,000 yards. But I also think it's something to be said that this is more becoming a passing league. And so it's going to be probably more common as the years go on, whereas we're probably going to see less 2,000-yard rushers, which I think makes Saquon Barkley's argument even stronger.
It's been really fun to kind of watch all of this go down. But one of the more interesting awards that have kind of been up for debate is the comeback player of the year. So before we really get into this debate, I think one of the more interesting things to mention is the fact that they've kind of changed this criteria. So the award previously was which player has done the best from his previous season, or which player overcame adversity in this way. But now it's kind of been changed to the player that best overcomes adversity or illness or injury. And so that's kind of changed the structure. But despite all of that, Sam Darnold is still the betting favorite for comeback player of the year at minus 135. So why don't you kind of make the case for Sam Darnold as to why he should win this award?
Sam Darnold, forgetting about, you could quietly, unfortunately, the last game against the Lions puts a bad taste in people's mouths of Sam Darnold, right? But, when you look at what happened in that game, they pressured him a ton. Like, teams aren't going to do that, I think, in the post. Maybe that's the formula to how to get to Darnold. But I think Kevin O'Connell is a smart enough play caller that they will try to figure out what went wrong in that game protection wise and try to mitigate that. But when you look at Darnold, he has a strong case for even MVP. And I'm not saying he is the MVP, but he should be in that second or third tier of guys behind, the Josh Allens, the Lamar Jacksons, even Jaden Daniels, who's creeping into that conversation, and Joe Burrow. But because when you look at Darnold, like, he's at the top of the league in passer rating at 105.4. He's 4th. 32 touchdowns this season passing, which ranks 5th. 251 yards per game, which ranks 6th in the NFL. He had a 67.2% completion percentage. He's had an awesome year. And so to me, with this criteria of what comeback player of the year is, what it isn't, Geno Smith won it 2 years ago from just being bad, and Joe Flacco won it. He didn't get hurt or anything. He just wasn't on a team because he wasn't good. Nobody expected Joe Flacco to come off the couch and start slinging the ball around, because nobody wanted him on their team, because they just didn't think he had it anymore. So to me, Darnold's a guy that deserves it with the narratives and everything that he's been through, hopping from team to team. He hasn't started, a full season for anybody since he was with the Jets. And so that was years ago. To me, Sam Darnold deserves it this year. He's overcome a lot, and forgetting about the physical stuff of injuries, like he's got one of the best records in the NFL. In many other years, they would be the number 1 seed in their conference. It just was unfortunate that they went up against the Lions, who just happened to have a better year, but not to discredit them at all. So I think Darnold deserves it this year.
Yeah, and I could also talk about Darnold for a long time, but winning 14 games as the leader of a pass-first offense just kind of says all that you need to know about the year that he's really been having. And you can bring up whatever stat you want, but I think probably the stat that tells the story the best is that he was top 3 in big-time throw rate. So he was the guy who threw the ball down the field, and that was their main source of offense. That's not someone you can just kind of work around. It's someone that you win games explicitly because of. And Darnold's had many highlights, but probably the best one is the fact that they're down by close to a touchdown against the Seahawks, and Darnold, about to get sacked, moves up in the pocket, hits Jefferson on a game-winning touchdown. And it just says a lot about how good of a season he's been having. But someone who I think has just as strong of a case is Joe Burrow. So he's sitting at plus 110 to win this award. But I think if you go based off of that definition that's kind of been used to categorize this award now, he leads the NFL in just about every passing category, in yards, in touchdowns, in first downs. He only has 9 interceptions. And I think with a better defense, you can easily consider him the league MVP. And he's also someone who's had that injury in the past with the wrist injury he had last season. And overcoming that and having arguably his strongest regular season is just something really impressive. And I think that's easily worthy of comeback player of the year.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
So moving on to the big award. This is the award that everyone has been debating about, with some great arguments, some really bad arguments, but the award we are here to talk about today is MVP. So before we start, really, let's talk about Josh Allen. He is sitting at minus 350. So why don't you kind of make the case for Josh Allen?
When we talk about Josh Allen, I think we need to paint the picture of what the narratives and what was being said by majority of the media, majority of, highly credible people. And many people looked at this team as third best in the division, right? Behind Miami, behind the Jets. And now the Jets had a terrible year, right? So people forget, right? And Miami had a bad year, and so people forget, right? But this was a team that was projected to be in a rebuild. They lost a ton of their captains, many players on defense. Their offense lost. He lost his top 2 wide receivers in Gabe Davis and Stephon Diggs. Nobody knew who Khalil Shakir really was. I mean, there were flashes last year, but outside of guys that were really into fantasy football that were drafting him at a value because he was attached to Josh Allen, not many people really knew who Khalil Shakir was. And Dalton Kincaid actually didn't have a great season this year. But when you look at it, he didn't have a single 1,000-yard receiver on this team. And the turnover that he had, I mean, he didn't have a single wide receiver catch a football from him in his wide receiver room going into this season outside of Khalil Shakir. And so, you can talk about all the stats and talk about, but when you take rushing and passing, all the touchdowns, all the interceptions, these two guys are neck and neck. And last year, Allen's stats were better than Lamar's, but Lamar had the high seed. And so that's what really was the tiebreaker. And so to me, I know people will say it's voter fatigue, but Josh Allen, it's not just giving a guy the award because you feel bad for him. The guy deserves it this year. I mean, Allen beat the number 1 seed in both conferences, teams that, the Lions only lost 2 games this year, and the Chiefs only lost 2 games this year. And the only game they've really lost was to Buffalo because Denver beat them in week 17 with the backups in the game. So I just think Josh Allen, he stepped up in the games, and people will throw out the head-to-head, and I get it. But both of these teams are vastly different than what they were to begin the year. I mean, the Ravens started off the year really bad record-wise. I think they might have started off 1-3 to start the year. Or it might have been 1-2. But regardless, I think Allen deserves it, and I think he should get it. I don't think it's voter fatigue. I think when you add the context behind the numbers, I think Allen 100% should be the guy that wins it. But I understand the case that can be made for Jackson. I think both guys are deserving, but I think it should go to Allen.
Yeah, I think voter fatigue is a fine argument to make as like a tiebreaker. But like you mentioned, Josh Allen, on his merits of this season alone, is worthy of the MVP. Like, he's just been incredible. The stat that I found the most funny is that if you go based off of cumulative EPA this season, Lamar Jackson is sitting at 173.4, which is number 2 in the league, and Josh Allen is sitting at 174.2. So less than a point of expected points separates the two, which just says how good of a season they're both having. But let's make the case for Lamar real quick. So first off, by most metrics, he's been the best passer in football. He has 41 touchdowns. He only has 4 interceptions. Just for reference, Tom Brady's career touchdown to interception ratio is 3-1. Lamar Jackson is sitting at 10-1, which is just incredible. And he's also probably the most dangerous running quarterback of all time. He's the guy who you least want to see the ball in his hands with the ability to scramble. And Josh Allen's a close second. Like, they're both really, really good in that regard. But both of those guys have just been really, really good. And, you know, Lamar may have better receivers, but the offense has been really good. And both guys are just really good. I would not have any problem with either of these guys winning the award, but Lamar Jackson, in terms of just pure counting stats, may have been a little bit better, but I think either guy could really win the award there.
Yeah. I mean, it's going to be interesting. I know that Vegas has shifted it to -350, but things could swing in this. I really wouldn't be surprised if Lamar ended up winning it, but I think overall, I think Vegas has it right at -350. I think it's going to go to Allen.
So Pete did have to get running, but I think this was a great discussion about the importance of each of the awards and the arguments that you can really make for both of those sides. It's something that I've talked about in my previous episode. But before I really close today's episode off, I want to talk about the power of narratives. And what's really important is just understanding how narratives kind of influence these types of awards. That most of these awards are won because they're able to tell a story. With Josh Allen, you have overcoming the adversity of losing your first wide receiver and still being so successful, of beating Patrick Mahomes, of beating Jared Goff in the Lions for the 1 seed. And being aware of that makes us more educated voters whenever it comes to determining who should win these types of awards. And so I think being able to do that makes us better fans. It makes us smarter fans. And I think the last thing I want to talk about today is that the NFL's embrace of numbers has really changed the way that we see these awards. Whenever we are looking at Defensive Player of the Year, we are going to advance numbers like pressures instead of just sacks. Whenever we're looking at quarterbacks now, Josh Allen has less passing yards. He has less rushing yards. He has less passing touchdowns than Lamar Jackson. But despite all of that, he is still the favorite to win MVP. And I think it's because the film says a lot about how good he's been, and the advanced numbers say a lot about how good he's been. And while this is just a discussion on MVP, you can make the same argument for almost every other one of these awards. But it just says a lot about the way that our perspective has changed in this sport. Whether it be who's winning the awards or who should be winning these playoff games, we are utilizing numbers just about every day. With that being said, this is the first video episode of Analytics with Asa. I want to give a huge thank you to Pete Nova for coming on, and there will be more episodes coming out soon. Thank you for listening.